institutes this Inquisition, and the hero of the Mihna is supposed to be Ahmad ibn Hanbal, blah, blah, blah. But in 1400 years plus of history, one Inquisition declared by a single caliph, that in itself it sounds like something that needs more investigation, because what was the process for identifying orthodoxy, identifying what is theologically acceptable versus what is not acceptable? Ask yourself, why has, if you compare European history and what happened to movements like the Cathars, for instance, or eventually even to the Knights of the Templars, and in Islamic civilization, you find some very interesting historical phenomena that have never been adequately explained. The survival of, for instance, Nusayris, or the survival of what are these the fellows in Lebanon, Druze. It is not just because they inhabited the mountainous area. I mean, Jabal Druze that survived, and the survival even of the Baha'is, even with all the calls of the jurists of outrage against Baha'u'llah in Iran, in Persia, the reluctance of executing him, and then he is exiled to Palestine, and so on. So and in fact, if you study trials, and this is a vast field of historiography that very few people have worked on, if you study trials in which people stood accused of apostasy or heresy, of Zandaqa in Islamic civilization, you're struck by not by their effectiveness, but by their ineffectiveness, by how difficult it was to convict people of Zandaqa and in fact carry out punishments. So the reason that the trial of Hallaj became famous is because if it was the norm, it would have not become such a symbol. But it's because it was an exception. It's remarkable to me that for all the people working on Islamic history and so on, and especially Muslim intellectuals, and yet no one has bothered to study how many procedures were brought in Islamic history with accusations of apostasy or zandaqa, to get even a sense of how many people were tried for such, what were the sentences in these situations, etc., etc. So this then, we come back to the notion. If the idea of a Salaf al-Salih is the prototype of Islamicity fulfilled, how do we explain then the existence of diversity, both orthodox and non-orthodox? What function did this, what function did this notion of righteous predecessors play in Islamic normativities in various parts of Islamic history, and how do they, in what ways are they similar or different than the function that that same concept plays in our modern age. In our modern age, for instance, the notion of the righteous predecessors, in vast majority of time, is it used to encourage disagreement or debate, or to end debate? In your own experiences. How many times have you heard in modern Islam someone says, well, you know, let's have some debate about this issue because the predecessors used to debate things? Never, right?
No.
Never.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, you'll just have to take my word for it. There's a famous Maliki fatwa in which the novel idea of a mosque built for women only. This was in Maghreb, in Morocco, and actually there was one in Medina, which the Wahhabis destroyed, burned down. Both are very fascinating stories, but there were mosques that were admission only to women. Now, if I tell you that in both of these fatwas, one by Maliki jurists and one by Hanbali jurists, both of them refer to as-Salaf al-Salih, okay? Now, this must give you a little bit of an intellectual pause, right?
Yeah.
How could the Salaf al-Salih, which is a statist idea, in our modern lived experience, the Salaf al-Salih is an idea used to promote conservatism, to promote non-change, to promote statism, to keep things static as they are. How then can we imagine a dynamic in which the same idea is used to construct something like a mosque, women's only mosque? Not only that, but there's something about the Medina women's only mosque that has given me a lot of trouble when discussing it in Muslim circles, because people just accuse you of being a liar, and then although you bring them the text, you know. And that is the mosque in Medina, the fatwa not only, that was not controversial, the women are led by a woman in prayer, because it's a women's only mosque, but that the question posed was that slave girls, when they go into the mosque, they pray without their head covered, right?
Yeah.
Without the scarf. And they asked whether the hara'ir, the free women, may take off their scarves as well in prayer, like the slave girls. And the jurist, citing the Salaf al-Salih, says, yes, that's not an issue. Now, I don't have my library with me, but if we were in Los Angeles, I would have, you know, drugged around the text and sat and translated it with you, and so, because you know, the Muslim reaction invariably is so, this sounds so alien that people think you're making it up. It cannot be. But explore that. What idea of the righteous predecessors, what construct of that could be, in what way can we construct it and yet cite it for something as unusual as a woman's only mosque, or even the free women taking off their hair covers in prayer.
Did they in fact have a precedent or have some way of saying that this is the sunnah or this is the practice of the companions? Was there something that they pointed to, or was it just a legal point, a fine point, like as men are not present, a hijab is not necessary? I mean, which direction did they go with?
This is a very good question. I mean, were they actually pointing to a precedent, or an actual precedent, or were they pointing to an ideal construct in the sense of, well, the spirit of the predecessors would say we do this or do that. The answer to just is that in the two fatwas, the two adjudications that I'm talking about, the Maliki and the Hanbali. The Maliki one actually pointed to a practice during the times of the companions, and particularly the way the opinions of Aisha. Interestingly, the Hanbali one did not cite that, but cited what it called al-maqasid. The maqasid is the objectives of the law, which is very much consistent with the notion of, well, the predecessors to fulfill the spirit of what the predecessor did. But this is my point in this is, look at it from a point of a historian, right? It's very, very tempting for a historian studying any concept to impose what you're familiar with upon a historical phenomena, right? And this is what we call an anachronism, right? You come and you study it and you say, well, Salaf al-Salih used here, Salaf al-Salih used here, and even without paying much attention, you assume that it must be the same. And your analysis then proceeds on that basis. If you are in a field where you are critically reviewed, some smart student comes along, notice that you haven't investigated your premises, and points to the weakness of your scholarship, and you look like an idiot, right?
Yeah.
But in a milieu in which scholarship is weak, in a field in which there isn't a critical mass, you get away with murder. You say things, no one challenges you, no one questions your assumptions, no one questions your methods, and then assume imagine the cumulative effect of these scholastic errors without any ill intent, without any boogeyman or a bad guy. We end up with bizarre constructs at the end simply because what we can call the work ethic itself is missing. With my students, I always one year my students gave me a plaque, so as a gift, and said, thank you for a year of headaches. And I know that I give my students headaches, and I sort of read the headachy features. So I'm going to close, or it's enough for today that I would say this, that we have what I would argue that the idea of the righteous predecessors has always been there. It's not a novel idea. And therefore, Salafi itself is a bit of a, it's like when people come, or Western scholars come and say, do you believe in, I'm sorry, not scholars, but like one time people from Homeland Security in the United States came to me and said, do you believe in jihad? Right? And as we will talk about, of course, how can I be a Muslim and not believe in jihad? I must believe in jihad as a Muslim. But it depends on what jihad is, right? And it depends on what, of course, so my response was, well, I gave a long lecture about what jihad is, and they looked very, very bored, and then at the end, they said, well, so, you do believe in jihad? Okay. But Salaf Salih is one of these ideas that in many ways, every Muslim is a Salafi because every Muslim will refer to something in the past.
Yeah.
But what is a reference to the past? This is sort of the initial question, it's not the last question. Because in human societies, how many anthropological or sociological phenomena can you point to in which people don't refer to the past in some form or fashion, shape or fashion? I mean, you lose the whole notion of rootedness. You can invent the past and refer to it. I mean, there's a wonderful article by Habermas about the Scottish kilt, where Habermas says, the kilt was never a part of Scottish culture. They invented it, but they needed it, and then it became a part of their identity. It doesn't matter, but the point is that in the same way we can say that in talking about Christian ethics, for instance, we can refer to Jesus and the disciples. That is not the end, that is the beginning. No one would seriously consider the idea that just because you refer to Jesus and disciples, that somehow we can predict what your position is. Similarly, in the Jewish tradition, if we refer to, even if we refer to the Talmud or Talmudic commentaries, or we refer to Rabbinic Judaism, or we refer to Halakha, or any of these references that involve the past, do not in themselves inform you about anything other than you claim some legitimacy from reference to something in the past, right? Look, in our own, in Western culture, reference to the past are constant and continuous. I mean, if you cannot open a book about law without references to the legal forefathers, and you cannot open a book about ethics without references to forefathers, whether you affirm them, you contest them, you refine them, you select among them, and so on and so forth. The puritanical move, though, is quite different than just a reference to the past. A puritanical move is the careful engineering of the particulars of the past and defining the momentum or the channeling of the momentum of the past. So the past is it's not like a seed that might grow into this size or that size, but the past becomes a unidimensional trajectory. And that is why in my own writing you will often find me using the word Puritans or Wahhabis, not Salafis, because so it doesn't tell me anything that you're a Salafi. And one of the things, if we had a Puritan or a Wahhabi with us here, is one of the biggest symbolic acts is the insistence on the exclusive claim over the Salaf. Because then they own the past. And by owning the past, they've lost, then we can all go home. I mean, they control everything. Okay. If they become the only ones that respect the forefathers, so to speak, the only ones that are actually implementing the will of the forefathers, the only ones who care about the forefathers, then the rest of us appear just like a bunch of rebel losers, like hippies of the 70s. We have no basis for anything. We just go around saying things, but they've controlled the playing field. And this is one of the biggest intellectual failures, in my view, in that critical ground is often conceded by Muslim reformers, and so they lose the battle. So they start out by saying, yes, we're not Salafis, or why should we refer to the well, if you think it's irrelevant to refer to the Prophet and the companions, you better have one heck of a theological justification as to where you draw your Islamic authenticity and your Islamic legitimacy. But most don't have such a justification, and so their influence, their impact among Muslims remains extremely limited. They remain heroes in the eyes of non-Muslims, like Irshad Manji or Hershey Ali and so on. Non-Muslims will clap all night for them. Oh, bravo, bravo! You're wonderful, you're brave, but they elicit nothing but revulsion among most Muslims. Okay, tomorrow we will start with the idea, critical theological idea, and that is submission. Submission, the essence of Islam. The idea of Islam of submission. And the rhetorics, or the rhetorical dynamics of the notion of submission. And so, if, other than the place of tolerance, which if you, as I said, the thing I would, if the lighter read is The Great Theft. If you want to read something heavier, Speaking in God's Name, or And God Knows the Soldiers, either would be. But I'll leave it up to you. I mean, ultimately, as long as if you manage to stay awake in these sessions, if you manage to show up and stay awake, in my view, that's a huge achievement. So,
no, just for the last, is it you agree with that? I mean, that's the Ghazali and Salafism is the one of the who distract. I mean, all the creativity in Muslim.
Ghazali?
Yeah, Ghazali and Salafism.
No, I don't agree. I think that this is like a Mickey Mouse history. What destroyed creativity is not Ghazali. The answer must be in something far more complex than that. And that that's too simplistic of an answer. And Salafis, my answer, Puritans, I would say, played a huge role in the destruction of creativity, and even in the destruction in the role of Islamic identity. But Salafis is a far more problematic.
Puritans.
I call them Puritans, or I call them Wahhabis, because it's really, the Salafiyah of Muhammad Abdu, for instance, or Kawakibi, a Syrian Salafi scholar. He was one of the greatest champions of democracy. And he saw democracy as the embodiment of a Salaf al-Salih. This is his construct. He saw Salaf al-Salih as a thoroughly democratic society. That's quite different from the way al-Mawdudi sees a Salaf al-Salih. So when anyone says, I am a Salafi, my response to them, so am I. And in fact, the whole dynamic between us is I am claiming to be a more authentic representation of the predecessors than the Puritans. So I don't concede that ground. And I don't think Muslim reformers or those who think of themselves as people who care about the fate of Islam and Muslims in the modern age should ever concede that ground. Once they conceded, I think most of the battle was lost.
I think that this is a very interesting area, the kind of progressive but intellectually honest and traditional in a way approach. And I was reading somewhere one of the things we were talking about Molids before everyone got this criticism of Sufi practice that you find in Wahhabi movements is that often there's emphasis on, well, why are people standing up and moving and singing and doing things that don't have precedent? As if having precedent is something that narrow, that you can't stand up in a certain moment. And I've slowly discovered there are very interesting traditional stories, things that come up in Hadith and the Seer of the Prophet, that actually make very interesting arguments for this kind of thing, like new Muslims coming from Abyssinia, and singing the Shahada, and dancing and performing. And there's a famous story of the Prophet lifting Aisha up. I guess she was still quite young, and putting her on his shoulder to look and watch the performance.
The performers in the mosque.
Which clearly a precedent from some kind of tradition. But to see something like that happen in the mosque in the Hijaz or somewhere like that would be, a riot. Something that clearly happened in the Prophet's time, and I very much agree that it's very much a shame that people that are on this progressive end are sort of doing it on their own, and not at least making an effort. I mean, of course, one can disagree with tradition on certain things, but at least know it. At least be able to make an argument from tradition.
Yeah, you could say the tradition. I mean, there are many ways you could even argue that. Either you argue that the tradition is not authentic, or you argue that tradition does not fulfill the potential of Islam, or the tradition is we can do better even. But in one way or another, you have to address the issue of tradition. You cannot simply skip that critical epistemological step. You have to have a way of, and not a blanket general way, but there are, and what's what I find fascinating is that the Islamic civilization itself, while